Oh, you name-dropping philosophers, bro? That's appeal to authority, bro. Arguments shouldn't be based on identity, bro. That's a popular, lightweight argument. Such a person thinks that they know what they're talking about, and it sounds good, but actually, name-dropping philosophers should be an indispensable part of discussing how to live well. Consider for a moment the possibility that you are not the smartest, or most rational, or best educated person that has ever lived. Horrifying, right? Now, consider also that you know that you are not the smartest, or most rational, or best educated person that has ever lived. In other words, consider the possibility that you are a relatively sober thinker. Let's then say that you want to have knowledge about how to live well. What do? You will probably begin by gathering the opinions that have come down to you, from ostensibly great thinkers as well as through popular opinion. After all, we have thousands of years of records of the debate about how to live well. You have to get caught up. You'll get caught up on a TV show. Shouldn't you get caught up on the debate? Let's add another stipulation. You know that you are not the smartest, or most rational, or best educated person that has ever lived, or lived recently, but you are convinced that science has fundamentally altered society and brought the truth about life into view for the first time, and so you only regard contemporaries and relatively modern thinkers as potential sources of advice. What do you do then? You'll probably still gather opinions, the only difference being that you won't have thousands of years of opinions to consider. But let's move on and ask the next question. Why wouldn't you gather opinions about how to live well? Why would you be satisfied with your own thoughts? Remember, we are talking about a person with a certain kind of humility. Supposedly, we can form our opinions with unaided reason, but we have already stipulated that reason tells us that there are better sources for wisdom than ourselves, and so reason points us to opinions and authorities. Classical writings typically begin by considering opinions. Leo Strauss describes the process well in his Natural Right and History, saying of the classical view that the being of things, their what, comes first to sight not in what we see of them, but in what is said about them or in opinions about them. Accordingly, Socrates started in his understanding of the natures of things from the opinions about their natures. For every opinion is based on some awareness, on some perception with the mind's eye of something. Socrates implied that disregarding the opinions about the natures of things would amount to abandoning the most important access to reality which we have, or the most important vestiges of the truth which are within our reach. He implied that the universal doubt of all opinions would lead us not into the heart of truth, but into a void. Philosophy consists, therefore, in the ascent from opinions to knowledge or to truth, in an ascent that may be said to be guided by opinions. It is this ascent which Socrates had primarily in mind when he called philosophy dialectics. Dialectics is the art of conversation or of friendly dispute. The friendly dispute which leads toward the truth is made possible or necessary by the fact that opinions about what things are, or what some very important groups of things are, contradict one another. Recognizing the contradiction, one is forced to go beyond opinions toward the consistent view of the nature of the thing concerned. That consistent view makes visible the relative truth of the contradictory opinions. A side point. If Strauss's portrayal of Socrates as hostile to the universal doubt of opinions, what we might understand as skepticism, seems strange, go back and reread the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, where he says that if you stare at the sun too long, you will go blind. We'll discuss that at more length in a different video. Also, I recall from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he says of the views he is considering that some of these views are expressed by many people and have come down from antiquity, some by a few men of high prestige, and it is not reasonable to assume that both groups are altogether wrong. The presumption is rather that they are right in at least one or even in most respects. If someone doesn't gather opinions about how to live well, I think the main reason is that they have more immediate concerns in their life. They may have a job that requires technical knowledge, and they just don't have the time to get caught up on the debate. Now we are ready for the important question. Let's say that our humble person has gathered opinions and is familiar with the debate. Why shouldn't that person refer to his or her sources in conversation? The charge of appeal to authority fails because, for instance, if I say that people should be satisfied to be crushed and educated in conversation, and I refer to Plato's Socrates saying in Book 1 of the Republic that the right penalty for ignorance is to be educated by someone that isn't ignorant, it is only appeal to authority in the final analysis if it is appeal to authority when Plato's Socrates says it. But Plato's Socrates doesn't cite a source, and so it isn't appeal to authority. This brings us to a fine reason for name-dropping philosophers. It is useful to place ideas in the context of systems of thought that are or can be generally known. For instance, central to Plato's thought is that living well is something that can be learned about. And so when I tell someone that Plato's Socrates says that education is the penalty for ignorance, I am invoking all of Plato's relevant thought and not only that one line. There is an objection to name-dropping philosophers that has some merit. If the person you are speaking to isn't familiar with your source, then they likely won't take your meaning as you intend it. But this objection merely needs to be weighed against the benefits of name-dropping. We can say that name-dropping should be done the right way for a particular audience. Remember, we are talking about a relatively sober thinker. He knows that there are better sources for wisdom than himself. He regards someone or some people as having the championship belts, and he knows that he will eventually part from his audience. He should want to point the conversation toward his sources, not toward himself, not only because of their superior wisdom, but also because they are generally available to the audience even after the conversation is over. So, an ignorant audience merely requires consideration about how to name drop. And given that our relatively sober thinker thinks his sources have the belts, it is probably possible to present their thought in a way that is interesting and may cause people to pursue it later. Another issue is the subject of plagiarism. If I think Plato and Aristotle have the belts and gratuitously rep their thought, but never give them credit, then I may have plagiarized their thought. One exception to this is if I am addressing an audience that I know has some kind of hostility to Plato and Aristotle, and I know that I would be better off either physically or rhetorically not mentioning them. But that doesn't rule out mentioning another source. For instance, in my case, what is more likely is that an audience is hostile to conservatism, which they recognize by certain buzzwords like free markets, the Constitution, and discussion about the founders. I find that gratuitously referring to Plato and Aristotle can disarm much of their hostility. Since Plato and Aristotle are so far removed from popular political discourse, and yet they are such considerable thinkers, I am able to have serious discussions with a lot of so-called ideological opponents, since it isn't clear that on other occasions I would criticize their sacred cows. Anyway, it does happen that confused people stubbornly insist that I tell them my views without dropping any names. My response is basically, my view is that Plato and Aristotle have the belts. I try to point to them. Then there's the point that name-dropping facilitates substantive conversation. It's like the line about how politicians should wear patches showing their sponsors like race car drivers do. Conversation can be made a lot more efficient if people are familiar with the debate and make it known who they think have the belts. Of course, this has to be balanced against the previous point, where name-dropping can make an audience hostile. It is for similar reasons that people cite trusted news sources such as the WAPO, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Of course, people have different preferred news sources, but they cite those instead of basket case companies like InfoWars. Another point to consider is that we can name drop implicitly, and it isn't necessarily plagiarism. If someone is familiar with the debate, then they may be able to figure out who you think has the belts, even if you don't drop any names. For instance, as soon as someone mentions the Iran coup from the 50s where Mossadegh was removed from power, I know that I am dealing with a Chomsky file or a descendant of Chomsky files. Also, When reading Augustine and Aquinas, I don't need any additional commentary to know that Augustine is Platonic and Aquinas is Aristotelian. It's just obvious from the form and subjects of their writings. Also, quite a lot of thought can only be traced generally, such as to hippies or classical liberalism. So, given that it is so difficult to utterly avoid name-dropping, it is curious that some people are so stubborn about it. But let's consider a fairly different rationale for name-dropping philosophers and other thinkers. There is thought that has altered society, and to understand society, sometimes when tracing its features, we are led to thinkers. I consider it to be very significant that Machiavelli wanted philosophers to change the way they behave. In The Prince, he wrote that, "Since my intention is to write something useful for anyone who understands it, it seemed more suitable to me to search after the effectual truth of the matter rather than its imagined one. And many writers have imagined for themselves republics and principalities that have never been seen nor known to exist in reality. For there is such a gap between how one lives and how one ought to live, that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation." Long story short, it is conspicuous, to say the least, that whereas prior classical thought focused on how to live well, and therefore presupposed an unattainable standard for perfect justice, the Enlightenment thought that followed Machiavelli focused on mere self-preservation so that the goal of politics could be achievable in real life. Alan Bloom wrote, discussing these thinkers, that there is no doubt that these were serious men, and that their contrivances had a public effect, unlike that of any philosophers or scientists before or since. Modernity is largely of these philosophers' making, and our self-awareness depends on understanding what they wanted to do and what they did do, grasping thus why our situation is different from all other situations. However contrary it may be to contemporary historical wisdom, the leading thread that runs through all the accidents of modern history is the philosophical doctrine of the Enlightenment. Modern regimes were conceived by reason and depended on the reasonableness of their members. And those regimes required the reason of natural science in every aspect of their activity. And the requirements of scientific advance largely determined their policy. Whether it is called liberal democracy or bourgeois society, whether the regime of the rights of man or that of acquisitiveness, whether technology is used in a positive or a negative sense, everyone knows that these terms describe the central aspects of our world. They are demonstrably the results of the thought of a small group of men with deep insight into the nature of things, who collaborated in an enterprise the success of which is almost beyond belief. It penetrated and informed every detail of life. These are not men to be dismissed, but they can be questioned. Bloom doesn't mention here that these thinkers also bear considerable responsibility for the circumstance that everyone you are likely to meet, especially among English speakers, believe that people have rights. We can debate Bloom's account, but it would require considering an alternate account. Since society is a result of previous generations, there is necessarily a historical dimension to understanding ourselves. In fact, history permeates our lives so thoroughly that there is a historical dimension to the abstract discussion of ideas. So, hopefully, we can knock it off with demanding that people express their own views without name-dropping philosophers. You should know that there have been much better thinkers than you, and thinkers who were better positioned than you. Much of our experience of the world begins with opinions. Name-dropping philosophers is useful to place a statement in the context of someone's generally available thought. It can be useful to facilitate conversation if people are familiar with the debate. It can be useful to disarm hostile prejudices, and most of all, people with names have thoroughly altered our society, and it is unlikely that we can understand ourselves without understanding them. Hopefully, you can become familiar with the debate so that you don't feel left out. Don't worry, we at the SolidQuarry of Relatively Sober Reason are here to help.